This time on the Prop Master, well, I make the blade for this lightsaber. And that's really just a nice way of saying that I brush a lot of glue onto some foam. I mean, I guess I did have to cut the foam out to the right shape. It's really not the cutting of the foam, it's the measuring. So the more we measure a lot and then we cut the foam out, then we brush on a lot of glue. And I guess we do also have to sand this into the right shape. So I'm going to brush a lot of glue onto the foam, and it's foam that I measured to cut out. And then look, I made a blade. So yeah, like I said, we're going to work on the blade this time. But that's not all. We're also going to talk about how I should have gone about making the skeletal structure from the last video. Mostly about how I should have filled the club shaft with epoxy. So the good news is if you do it this way, you won't have any rattles in your lightsaber, unlike the way I did it in the first video. But I do want to apologize if you've already started on yours. Unfortunately, there's no way I can really go back in time and fix that. But if you want to make one that doesn't rattle, you'll be able to see how to do it in this video. Something else I should probably apologize for is I'm having some problems with the microphone. So some parts of the video are going to be real easy to hear, hopefully like this. Other parts of the video, the mic didn't work, so it's just the microphone on my phone, and it might be a little bit harder to hear. I've done everything I can to make it as clear as possible, but if you don't understand something or have any questions, just leave a comment below and I will definitely respond as quickly as possible. I guess that's a pretty good segue into please like and subscribe and comment. If you can boost this video any way you can, I would really appreciate it. But with all that out of the way, we better get to work. Okay, so this is what we're going to use to make our blade. This is just a sheet of 8mm wide EVA foam. You can find this stuff online all over the place. Then for a while, it looked like you could get it at almost any type of, craft store or art supply store. It seemed like everybody was getting into the cosplay business, but that seems to have fallen off somewhat more recently. Although I did see some sheets of EVA foam at Hobby Lobby, I think it was. Hopefully places like Michael's and other hobby shops and craft stores will pick back up where they were before. This is my straight edge. You don't need any kind of a special straight edge. This just happens to be one that I've got in the garage. You could also just as easily use whatever ruler you're going to be using to take your measurements. And I guess at this point I can go ahead and introduce you to my new internal skeleton, so to say, with the correct size PVC pipe. This turned out great, except for one thing. I did not have that rattle when I finished putting the epoxy into the club shaft, but for some reason right after I glued it into the PVC pipe, that little rattle started. So hopefully once I get this covered with foam, that'll cut down on any vibration and you won't get a lot of rattling, because that's going to be really annoying if that does not fix it. That said, if you have a thinner form of epoxy, I would probably use that, assuming that it's not once again, some kind of super hard, brittle epoxy. In fact, I know that most craft stores now have a mold casting or a resin casting department. So I think I'm going to go this afternoon and see what kind of resins they have. And if they have something that looks like it's a thinner epoxy or some other kind of resin, I'll let you know what I find out, because a thinner resin would work much better being poured into such a small space. But now that we have the correct piece here, Let's go ahead and take some measurements. The first thing we want to do is to start out at the tip. Start off at this tip and take a measurement from there. And we want to measure back this way 31.5 inches or about 80 centimeters. And we want to make a mark on that. Doesn't have to be exact, but you know, get as close as you can. And once you have that marked, let me see if I can't mark that in a way that shows up on camera real quick. Okay, that should be a little bit easier for you to see. So this edge of that tape is 31.5 inches or 80 centimeters. And I want to measure the width of the shaft at this point. And you know, you can easily use calipers for that pretty easily. Or if you don't have any calipers, if you just want to take some blocks, they obviously don't have to be 1, 2, 3 blocks. They can be made out of 2x4s. That'll work just fine. Just make sure that they are 90 degrees from, you know, the side and the bottom, so that you get parallel, and you know, these are parallel to each other and perfectly perpendicular to the ground. But you can lay those there, and then I can go ahead and measure. I'm going to go with millimeters because it's going to be a lot easier to, you know, to be precise. And that is exactly 15 millimeters. That's about what, I don't know, like maybe 9/16 of an inch. And I'm going to write that down. From there, I'm just going to go up here, and at this smallest spot, in the smallest diameter area here, right before it starts to flare back out again, I'm going to do the same thing, and I'm going to measure that. That looks to be about 9 millimeters, maybe. I think that's 9 millimeters. It's hard for me to see from that angle. Let me see what the calipers actually say. Yeah, 9 millimeters. And I'm going to write that down. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is I am going to go ahead and measure from my mark here. I'm going to measure and see what it is to this narrow spot here. Let's go with the more precise side. That is, in my case, 30 7/8 of an inch. And let's write that down. The next thing we want to do is we just want to take a measurement to see what the distance is between this narrow spot and the part of this that has the widest diameter. That would probably be better in millimeters again. In my case, that is 1.5 centimeters. And then once again, I want to measure to find out what the diameter is at that spot. And you know, you can do this. Looks like it's about 11 millimeters. And write that down as well. Okay, now that I have all that information, we can go ahead and transfer that over to the foam. Just like before, this is a different way than I've done it in the past. What I did in the past was I literally just cut a 16 millimeter strip of foam, cut that down the middle, and just ran it down on each side of this. And I did that instead of on this 8 millimeter foam, I did it on 12 millimeter foam. The problem with that is that you end up on this narrower end, you end up with a lot of foam above and below the shaft itself. The way I'm going to do it this time, We'll have a couple more steps, but it'll be, I think, a lot easier in the long run. As is so often the case, the explanation comes off way more complex than the actual, process of doing it. It's actually pretty simple, it's just hard to explain, or complicated to explain. So all I'm going to do at this point is I want to make a straight line, maybe an inch from this edge, and I want to measure 32 inches. That's about 81.3 centimeters. Okay. Now, at this end, I'm going to measure out what we took our first measurement from, which was the diameter at this point right here, which was at 31.5 inches from the tip. And if I look at my paper, it says that was 15 millimeters. And I'm going to measure that, cut that in half, so that's 7.5 millimeters. And I want to measure, above that and put a mark, and do the same thing below that. So okay, and now I'm going to measure from here, that direction, and that measurement was, I decided it was 30 7/8 of an inch. Okay, now that I have this measurement, I want to measure and mark onto there the width that we measured at this narrowest spot right here. That was 9 millimeters. So half of that would be 4.5 millimeters. This is very awkward to do on camera. Hopefully that's my one time to say that. And we can go ahead and mark those. Next, I'm going to measure 14 millimeters, which is the measurement from here to there. And none of this has to be super accurate. Boy, I was wondering why that looked so weird. That was inches, not centimeters. This looks way better. And the diameter at that point was, I say 11 millimeters. It's real odd numbers. So 5.5 millimeters. I can connect those dots. And we'll go from here over to there at 31.5 inches. And I'm just going to draw a rough curved in. Like I said, none of this has to be super accurate. Now using these utility knives that have the long blades where you can break a new tip off. In general, I don't like them, but for cutting foam, they're extremely helpful just because they are so long. You can take a very shallow cutting angle, whereas with a shorter blade, which almost any other knife is going to have, you'd be more like cutting from this angle to get all the way through the foam. And you get a much better cut if you can have a much shallower angle. That's going to give you a much cleaner cut in foam. And I'll try to do this on camera, but I think there's a good chance you either won't be able to see it or I won't be able to do it. This is just a little bit awkward. And my measurements were sort of in the middle of these lines, so that's what I'm going to use. If you use a thinner pen, that would be helpful. And I can't see where this line actually starts. Maybe I'll do this. Now I can set my straight edge up against that. Line it up on this end. And while keeping the blade as straight up and down as possible. There's our cut. And I've messed it up. I completely went on the outside of the line over here. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and cut the rest of this out off camera so I can actually see what I'm doing, and I'll be right back. So here's our piece that we just cut out. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this to trace another one on this little piece above, just to save material. And I'm going to secure it with just a little pin. I want to be gentle and not stretch the foam out, but I also want it to be straight. Instead of tracing that on in here, I'll just put my measurements on here. In other words, I'll make a mark here. I'll make a marks here, here, and then I connect those dots. And that'll guarantee that we'll get a straight line. Well, as much as I can actually mark a straight line. When you start getting thin pieces of foam like this, you have to be careful about the foam bending. So for that, you might want to go to a thicker piece of foam instead of a little piece like this, but I'm just trying to be economical. I just realized that I messed up. I don't need to cut this out because it's got to go past here to where we made this measurement out here. Because we want there to be about a half of an inch from the end of this piece out to the actual end. So the piece you cut out should actually look more like this, with this little square piece on the end of it, which I can still cut out and glue that onto the end here. All right, I'm gonna cut those out and I'll be right back. So here's the pieces after I've cut them out, and I've glued this little piece on, so everything's good now. This is the other piece that I cut out, and honestly, I had to kind of freehand it because when you get such a small piece of foam, it's hard to get it to actually sit underneath your straight edge without just, moving all over the place. So I just cut that out freehand and did a pretty terrible job of it. But you know what? It's going to be perfectly fine because none of this has to be that, precise. I'd probably suggest if you're going to do this and you want to be more precise about it, make sure that whenever you cut a piece out that it's how to describe this, that it's still attached to the larger piece of foam. So say cut this one out and then make your other measurement on the piece of foam, the large piece of foam, not a little tiny little flexible piece that's on the outside of that, like I did. That'll make it much more structurally sound when you are able to cut it. The other thing that you'll need to do is to, in the same foam, cut out a 16 by 16 millimeter square. Or what is that? It's about 5/8 of an inch. That's going to actually be larger than we need, but that's fine because we can trim it down afterwards. What we want to do now is to take our little square that we cut out, and we're going to glue it to first one piece and then the other, like so. And to glue that, we're going to use barge cement. This is very similar to contact cement. It is a type of contact cement, but it's similar to rubber cement or the kind of contact cement you'd use to put linoleum down or something like that. But this works much better than that does. If you just go to a home store and get some of that contact cement, it's nowhere near as strong as this stuff is. Barge cement is what they use to make shoes. I have seen recently that there is actually a barge cement, it's like shoe repair cement or something, that might be even stronger than this. I don't know, I've never used it. I've always just used the all-purpose cement in this sort of orange and yellow colored can. There's also another can that's supposed to be safer as far as the fumes go, and that stuff actually gave me a huge headache trying to use it. So I'm going to stick with this. Now that said, use this in an area with good ventilation, because this stuff is pretty much just the thinner that they use for this is toluene or some toluene. It's something that we used to use as a octane booster in the track cars. When you have a forced induction car and you're running it really hard in the high heat, you want a very high octane fuel, and often you can't find anything that's that high of an octane, so you can add toluene to the gas and get that to increase your octane. Also, I think it's the second T in TNT, but I'm not sure about that. But that has nothing to do with this, except for it's nasty stuff. It's not healthy to breathe. So you don't want to be, you don't want to be in a confined space. I can't talk. So make sure you have good ventilation, and you can find this on the internet easy. Just do a search for barge all-purpose cement, and you'll find a dozen dealerships of this. We used to carry this in craft stores. I have not seen it recently, but you can always keep an eye open in craft or hobby stores and see what they have. Art supply stores as well. Clean that off as well as I can. And I'm just going to put some on this piece of the foam. And I'm also going to put it on this piece of foam here. In fact, we could just do both sides of this. We can do it that way. We don't have to wait for everything to dry several times. We can just do this once. So we'll do both sides of this piece. And then let's also do the back of this. Now we just need to wait a couple of minutes for this to dry to the point that it is tacky, but nothing comes off of you. If I touch it, nothing's going to come off. It's just going to feel a little sticky. So we'll be back in a couple of minutes. Okay, let's take a look. Actually, I don't even feel it's not even really sticky. So it's definitely dry. Let's see if it'll stick. I may have let it. I only waited about 2 minutes, but we'll see. And that's where our piece is going to go all the way into there, but I'm going to go ahead and put this all the way across that, because it's foam, and the shaft of that golf club will be able to push into this without any problem. So I guess mostly I'm concerned with getting this piece in the right spot. Yeah, so that's well attached. And I'm going to do the same thing here. Okay, and that is well attached. In a couple of hours, it'll be attached even better, but even just for touching it there, it's, super stuck. So now we have this piece just like that. Now, if you don't want to go to all this trouble, which I've never done in the past, I just took a piece of 12 millimeter foam and cut 16 millimeter section out, and then came in a half of an inch from the end and then cut that down the middle. Now, I actually punched a hole in this one just to see how well it would work. I just took a little rod, sharpened it with a file, and then you just go back and forth and it'll cut a nice little hole there. In the past, I've never even done that. And you can stick this on here just like this. And once you glue this on here, it works absolutely fine. It's not perfect, but in the past it's worked perfect. It has worked very well. You can see what the issue is, and which is on this end, the club shaft is a little bit bigger than the foam, so it sticks up a little higher than the foam does. And then down here, the shaft is actually sunk quite a ways into the foam. So when we come back after this and we put another piece of foam across the top, there's a little bit of a gap there that you have to kind of push down in there to get it to stick. And I've had one of my swords in the past, it still worked fine, but it kind of came loose on the inside and the foam was not actually attached to the golf club shaft. And it, rattled and kind of twisted and stuff. It still worked fine, but it bugged me a little bit. So I think it's going to be better to do it this way, where everything's going to be very firmly attached to the sort of skeletal golf club shaft all the way down. Doing it this way, it's going to be pretty closely even all the way down the length of the golf shaft. And there's a couple places where I kind of screwed up pretty badly on this one, where I had to freehand cut it. It's still going to be fine. I promise you. But now that we have that, we can go ahead and start gluing this onto the shaft here. And I think I'm going to do it one piece at a time. I'll do one side, stick it on, and then I'll do the other side. If we try to do both of them at the same time, it's just going to get, especially when we start trying to put this end piece in here, it's going to be really easy to glue it to the sides like that, and it won't go all the way on. So it'd be much better to get it to where we can, stick it like that, and then put the glue on here and stick it down on this side. You want to cover the surface well, but you don't want big globs of glue. You want it to be as smooth and, you want a smooth and thin coat. If you're worried it's not enough, you can always put 2 coats on. Put 1 coat on, let it dry, about a minute, and then put a second coat on. You don't usually have to do that for barge cement, although I have in the past. And if you want to go the other route where you just cut it out and cut down the middle, you treat it exactly the same way as this. And you should probably put some gloves on before you do this. I'm sure it's not good for your skin, and then you spend the rest of the night going like this trying to get the glue off your fingers. I try to use gloves and I usually forget. Another reason to only do one side of this at a time is it's going to be really easy for this to stick to itself, or whether half of it if you do both sides. And while that dries, I'm going to go ahead and do the side of the shaft itself. I'll probably do pretty much half of it. That'll be more, area than I actually need, but better to have a little bit of glue that isn't used at this particular moment than to have a section that doesn't have glue on it. Eventually, every part of this will be glued, so you know it's all going to have glue on eventually. It would have been a good idea. I forgot to do it. It's worked both ways, doing it and not doing it, but what I should have done was taken a very fine sanding stick and just kind of gone over this whole thing to give it a little bit of a tooth for the glue to grab onto. You don't want to use a coarse sanding stick because once again, we don't want to damage the shaft at all. Okay. Keep everything separated and let that dry for about 2 minutes, and then we can start putting it on. Okay, it's been about 90 seconds, and see, this is sticky, but nothing is coming off of it when I touch it. So that's what we want. And this, I'm sure, is going to be very awkward on camera. Okay, now I'll do my best to keep this lined up and try really hard not to stretch the foam, because you'll end up with way more length on here than you were expecting. I'm kind of holding it, I'm pinching it between two fingers here so that I can know that this bottom part is where the glue is. And I'm going to skip ahead and kind of put this where I want it to end. Now I know that I can't stretch it way past it and be, way back here somewhere, which is easy to do with this foam. And I'm going to end up doing a little bit of compression in the foam, which is much better than stretching it out. And that hit in kind of a weird way. So I've got a little weirdness there. Once again, it's going to be totally fine. I'm just pushing the edges up here so that I can make sure that it's stuck. The entire face of that foam is attached to the shaft. I think you can kind of see that, where it's attached up here and then here it's not attached. And then do the same on the other side. Okay. Now I can flip this over and do the exact same thing on this side. Let's be very careful not to let any of the foam touch the shaft before we're ready to. And once again, I forgot to put my gloves on. I'm going to go ahead and do that real quick. Okay, we'll come back and take a look at this again in about a minute. It's been almost a minute. And okay, so when I touch it here and pull off, you can see that glue is pulling off and sticking to my finger. That means it's not quite dry enough yet. So I'll give it another 30 or 40 seconds. All right. And there we go, we're sticky, but nothing comes off. Yeah, we're good. So The first thing I want to do is to make sure that this tip ends up straight, and then I can kind of clamp down on that. Okay, now I'm going to let this cure for 45 minutes to an hour, and then we can put another piece of foam across the top and another piece of foam across the bottom. But I will see you in an hour. So what I want to do now is just lay this down. Try not to waste too much foam. And you can either just mark your, your end here down here on this end, and then come here and mark your corners here and use a straight edge, or you can just lay this down the way I've done it here and draw a line. And much like I did with one of these sides, I'm just going to freehand cut this. You can use a straight edge if you want, but I'm just going to try and hold this as perpendicular as possible and cut along the line. Better to be too big than too small, but even if you're a little too small, it's not a big deal either, because a little power fluctuation there. Just because we're going to take the corners off, eventually we'll turn this from being having a cross section of a square to a circle. Obviously, you'll want to find a spot where you can cut without damaging the surface underneath your foam. And we can mark these. I'll say side one, and oh, actually that's not side one, or this isn't side. This can be side one, but this has to be side two. So lay it down like that. So side two and side two go together. You'll just want to make sure you hold everything down good so you're not getting underneath to make your line. But even if you do, it won't be that big a deal. Okay, now we just need to glue these together. Actually, I guess it'll go that way. Just need to be consistent. Let's go ahead and take the rest of this foam out of the way. Okay, so let's just glue this all up. If you're going the route where you just cut a 18 millimeter section out and then split it down the middle, just remember that this is 12 millimeter foam, but you're still going to want to use the 8 millimeter foam for these parts. That was one of the reasons why I went with this process, so that I could use the 8 millimeter foam for everything. Let's do the side one first. You want to work fairly quickly because I want this and the other piece to be ready to stick together at roughly the same time. If you've had your barge cement for a long time and it's kind of thick and doesn't want to go on nice and even like this, you can buy barge cement thinner, and you can just add some of that into your barge cement and stir it in and just keep adding it until you get the sort of a thinner consistency the way this is. This is a brand new can. And I'll give that a few seconds to dry off to the point that it's sticky or tacky, but nothing comes off my fingers. Okay, this is pretty much dry. It's got a little bit of tackiness to it, but not too much. Obviously, I can just flip this over and sort of hold this so that it doesn't touch and stick it on there. But you can also buy yourself a little bit of insurance on that by just taking something, doesn't have to be paper, and laying it down on top of this piece, cover it all up, so that there's no way that these can stick together. And I want to start at this end because this is the end that absolutely has to end here. The other end, if it goes too far, it'll be fine. And just like everything else, this does not have to be perfect. I'm just going to line it up by feel. Yes. You have to be careful with that tackiness. I'm just letting it stick together at this point. I'll go back afterwards and make sure everything is stuck down good. And if it doesn't line up perfectly, that's fine. For this part of the build, basically just don't worry about it. Just get it on there. Yeah, I definitely managed to stretch it somewhere along the way because it is quite a bit longer here. That's fine. Now I want to make sure that this sticks all the way down, all the way across. Okay, let's just repeat the process and do this side now. Okay, I think we're ready. This time I'm just going to do this without the paper. And much the same way, I ended up with a bit too much foam. Just means that when I was first doing it, I probably just stretched it out a little bit. But since they're the same length, at least it means it won't be trying to pull the blade one way or the other. Now, one other thing that you could do if you went the other route with the 12 millimeter foam is you could actually put more 12 millimeter foam at the top and the bottom like this. If you were to go that route, I would say don't do the width that is 16 millimeters wide for this centerpiece, and then split it down the middle. I would go with I don't know, like maybe 20 millimeters wide. That would give you a much thicker piece of foam. But you'd be using the same foam, and then when you shaped it, you'd probably just shape it into the finished product, whereas this, we're going to shape this into a cylinder as well as we can, and then it'll actually get wrapped with another layer of foam on top of that. which I find to be the best as far as aesthetics. But several of the earlier lightsabers that I did not do that. I just used thicker foam at this point and then shaped it into a cylinder and left it the way it was. The problem with that is that it's got a bit of a fuzz to it after all of the sanding, and no matter what I did, I couldn't get rid of that fuzz. And then when you paint over the top of that with Plasti Dip, it actually accentuates those little pieces of fuzz into little sharp things. Now those go away over time though. Okay, so we've got this pretty much taken care of. We want to definitely let this sit and cure for at least 2 hours before we go on to actually trying to shape this into a cylinder. So I'm going to let this cure, and I'll be back in about 2 hours. Okay, so clearly a lot has happened since the last time you were here. Let me walk you through it. Do you remember when I was saying that I was really hoping that adding the foam on was going to damper the vibration in the blade so that it wouldn't rattle so much? Well, obviously that's not working. So, you know, that wasn't going to work. Although I suppose if I was a toy manufacturer, I would just say that's a sound effect of the lightsabers coming together, but I could charge you more for that. Yeah, I didn't like that at all. So I went ahead and made a third one. No rattle at all. And that really comes down to the fact that I ditched the JB Weld and went to Michael's and found this casting resin. I don't know if it's easier to see back here in the light. Yeah, so I just went to the art supply store into their casting area and found quite a few different epoxies. This is the one that I settled on, which is amazing casting resin. This one's in white. They also had it in black. I think there's also a clear, but it's a little bit different. But the main thing is that this is still a fairly quick curing resin. Instead of 5 minutes, it's I think 8 to 10 minutes. But here's the thing, if you look at the parts A and B, look at this where you can see it. I mean, it is a liquid. This one you definitely can't see, but they are both very thin. Maybe not as thin as water, but a lot closer than the JB Weld Clear Weld, which is somewhere, you know, the viscosity of thick honey. And so that allowed it to get into all the little nooks and crannies when I was pouring it into the blade. And so it is the way I hoped. It's a solid piece. No rattle at all. Now there are a couple of caveats that go along with this. Not bad, you just need to be aware. One of them is that because it's so much thinner, more of it actually pours out. Whereas with the clear weld, I don't know, maybe as much as an eighth of it stayed in the cup. And that's why this was the right amount here. Whereas with this stuff being so thin and more of it comes out, I had an overflow on this one. So probably you might want to reduce the amount that I said before by, you know, maybe a quarter, and then you can always add more afterwards or do hot glue like we did on the first one. The other thing I'd mention is that this stuff is sort of hypersensitive to flash curing if it's in a concentrated amount. In other words, if I take a cup full of it and spread it out across the table, that's going to take 8 to 10 minutes to cure. But if it's all concentrated in the cup, you might only have 2 to 3 minutes. When I was filling the shaft, I poured a tiny bit into here so that I could then drop my first piece of solder in and let it float to the bottom. I wanted to make sure it could get into the bottom of the shaft. And I did that, and then I decided I wanted to check the depth of that piece of solder. And I ran over and grabbed a dowel, and by the time I came back and checked it, which was less than a minute, I came to pour the rest of the resin in, and I basically had a rubber, a little rubber cup, basically. So in the directions it says to put part A in, put part B in, mix for 1 minute, and then immediately pour it. That's pretty good advice. Oh, and one last little bit of information about that. I didn't want to go out and try to find another one of these bolts, so I used the one that I had here. And if you have a similar situation, all you have to do is I put this in a vise, took a torch and just heated the bolt up, not excessively hot, not hot enough to melt the PVC obviously, but just enough that it would loosen the hot glue, and then took a wrench and was able to pry this out. So unfortunately I can't go back to the first video and warn you not to use the other epoxy, but instead to use this casting resin. I guess this is going to reward you if you watched both videos before you started working on this. Otherwise, look, you've got a sound effect. Yeah, I can't think of a way to come back in and fix this, so I'm not sure what I'm going to do with this one. But with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start taking the corners off of this and rounding everything out. Okay, so I've moved my belt sander out here so that it's kind of away from everything else, and I can film this a lot easier. Obviously do it wherever you're comfortable doing it. And I like to tilt this part up at a little bit of an angle so that I can get to a small cross section here. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this and I'll just be pulling it across that edge. If it's flat, it's just a lot harder to do that. If you are using a handheld belt sander, you've got that in a vise, or if it has some kind of a holder, if you can get it in a way that you have sort of either totally vertical or at an angle so that you can get to a small section of the belt at one time, that's definitely the easier way that I've found to do it. If you're doing this with a Dremel, what I would probably do is go in with my long utility knife and try to cut the corners off with that, and then just start trying to round it off with the Dremel. It's definitely doable. It's just going to take some time. I don't think you'd be able to do this with a sanding stick. I think, well, I guess you could, but it might take you a year. It's just, you can smooth things with a sanding stick, this foam, but it's going to be really hard to remove this much of the foam with just a file or a sanding stick. And definitely wear a dust mask, or like I'm wearing here is a filtered face mask. You don't want to be breathing in, microscopic or very small particles of foam. And I have to apologize, this thing's on its last days, and there's a bearing going out or a bushing going out, and it's very loud. So, hearing protection would be good too. But what I'm going to do is, like I said before, I think the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to try to flatten out these sides that are I have pieces that are of varying widths, so I'll try to flatten these out first. First, let me just point out that I'm going against the direction of the blade, and I'm not pushing down. I'm just letting its own weight do that. Now, if I get down here where it's not much pushing down, I might push down just a little bit. I want to try to maintain a uniform amount of pressure. Also, I'm letting it sort of twist or whatever to keep a flat face on here. I don't want to take off, just a corner of one of these. And if you make a mistake and you gouge a big chunk out of this, just cut another piece of foam, glue it on with the barge glue or the barge cement, and let that cure for a couple of hours, and then you can shape that back to being, the way it should be. Now, you want to be careful when you first do this, because it's going to be really easy to round off this edge right here, which I do not want to do. I want to try to keep this, fairly sharp. So always being very gentle and just kind of laying it right on that edge and move it. Also, there's a couple of spots here where I've succeeded and then other parts where I have not. So I want to keep that in mind and not start taking off huge amounts of foam here. Okay, so now that I have this somewhat uniform, I mean it's not, it's very rough still, but that's okay. I don't want to worry about this too much and take too much foam out of the middle parts. But at this point, we can go ahead and start taking off these corners, because all I really want to do at this point is to make this into a somewhat cylindrical shape. So first I'll start taking off the corners, and not too deep, but maybe taking off 3/8 of an inch or so here. Take out maybe 5 millimeters, somewhere in that area of just the corners. And do be very light with this, because there's so little foam at this point that you could easily just dig all the way to the golf club shaft. Okay, so now that we have these corners taken down a little bit, you're starting to get more of a cylinder shape. And one way you can tell if you're being consistent with your how much you're taking off, you can actually see the width of where I've taken it off. So I've taken this corner off, and so you can kind of see a flat section there. And if that width of that section is pretty uniform, then you're taking off roughly the same amount of foam all the way down. If you get where it's really thick and then really thin, then you're digging down further into the foam in some areas, and you want to try to avoid sanding those areas anymore until you get it where it's more consistent. I might take these corners down a little bit more, and then after that we can start the procedure of just kind of making this a cylinder. And eventually you'll get to the point where all of your facets are roughly the same size. And that's when you'll know you can start just rounding things over. Now I've got the facets that I've just put in are all about the same size, but the flat spaces, those are not. They're getting a little thinner, and this one's still much thicker than the facets that I put in. This one's thinner than the facets that I put in. So I'm gonna go ahead and start hitting the more narrow facets. Sorry, I'm being very bad at this. I'm gonna start the narrower facets. I'm gonna start sanding those and bringing them down to where they're the same width as these larger facets. Eventually you'd want every side's facet to be the same width. If you don't get there, that's totally fine. Let me show you something. This one right here, it seems like really well rounded, fairly symmetrical, but in reality, if you feel it, I can feel that it is substantially wider here than it is here. But because of the intensity of the color and the fact that everything is so smooth, you cannot ever really tell whether or not this is perfectly cylindrical or not. It's going to be fine. But I'll continue on this. Okay, so what's starting to happen now is that those smaller flat areas that I had are now wider, closer to the ones that were bigger, but now that's making my corner facets smaller. So now I can start hitting those corner facets again. I might hit these two flat areas again once and then go back to the facets. And I'll continue that process until I have, every facet, corner or flat is roughly the same width. One thing I did forget to mention is that if I do this side here on the top, I'll flip it over and do the opposite side afterwards. So if you do one side, do its opposite side immediately afterwards. Exactly the same way. Once you're happy about the size of your facets and the consistency of your facets, then you can start rounding it off, which means I'm basically just going to start hitting every corner until it's, seems, it doesn't have to be perfectly round at this stage, or cylindrical, but we just want to sort of start taking off all these corners. Oh, and try not to round off the end or this part here, which is easy to do because when you're coming off of here, you can easily kind of go zinc, and that's going to slowly round your corners off. Okay, at this point, I'm pretty much feeling, when I feel a corner, that's what I'm going for, because I can see lots of little corners, but it's hard to pinpoint them when I'm, from here. So I really just feel it around, and when you feel an obvious big corner, yeah, it goes most of the way down, so I'll go ahead and hit this whole thing. But if I only feel a sharp corner in one small area, that's probably caused by when we put the foam on, there's a little bit of a twist or something that we did not manage to follow here. So if it's just a sharp corner from here to here, then just lightly sand from there to there. maybe a little beyond that to, smooth things out. Yeah, I'm just feeling for a corner, and if I feel a big corner with my fingers, I'll hit that. Okay, so at this point, I've got all the big stuff done, and if there's further facets that I want to try to take out, it's probably going to be easier to do that with a Dremel. Also, what you saw me there at the end was I was just trying to take that little bit of a swell that I had at the end here at the tip, where that swells out a little bit. I just wanted to smooth that out so that it's more in line with the rest of the blade. Okay, let's move over to the Dremel. Now, to be totally honest, this is probably already smooth enough. Even though there are clearly facets here, this is close enough to a cylinder that it would be totally fine. But I'm going to go ahead and take some more of these little corners out, and yeah, they're just a little bit too fine to do on the big belt sander. But I'm going to go ahead and smooth this out a little bit more using the Dremel tool. Now, I prefer this type of bit here. It's like a cone. It's a conical shaped grinding stone, sharpening stone. It's like this. 952, I guess, is the number. Now, it's nowhere near as abrasive as the actual drum that you normally would see this kind of stuff. This is much coarser. It's going to work much better at removing foam. And most of the people that I see doing this with a Dremel would use this tool. I can't seem to use this tool without catching this little corner here and cutting big grooves in the foam. I've tried it 100 times, and as soon as I feel like I'm doing okay, I'll cut a big divot in the foam. So I prefer using this cone that doesn't have this front edge here. I just don't seem to have the self-control to do that. So like I said, I prefer this cone here. And I'm just going to run it across these corners to smooth everything out. And I'm switched over to a dust mask because it's just a little bit of a pain to deal with that hood and talk to you. This rotates this direction right here. So I want to go like this so that it's actually kind of pulling me along. So if I try to pull it back, it has a tendency to catch on the foam and just dig deeper. So it makes it a lot harder to smooth things out. You tend to get wavy effect where it'll dig in and take a big chunk out and then come back up. So if you go in the direction that it's trying to pull you along and just holding it back, you get a much smoother effect that way. Okay, as you can see, it's still not perfectly smooth. I can still see where there's some high spots, some little facets, but this is plenty smooth for what we need right now. And I'm just going to continue to do that throughout the rest of this so that this will be more like this. And I'll be back when I'm done. Now that we have this as smoothed and round as we want to get it, there's just one last thing we have to do. And I mean, don't get me wrong, you could go ahead and leave this the way it is. You know, you've got some of these little faceted areas here, but once you get that painted, you're not going to notice it as much. So to get a smoother surface, a rounder surface, and a little bit thicker surface, even though this is pretty close to what a hard bladed lightsaber would be, it starts to, over time, look a little beat up when it's left this thin. So I'm going to make it a little bit thicker. I think it looks a little bit better in general. So we're going to put on a layer of foam over the top of this. So what we want to do is, this is just that little 3mm piece that I used to cut the little pieces that we stuck onto the golf club shaft so that we could slide it into the PVC. And I'm just going to wrap this around at the end here. And I'm going to mark that. And I'm going to take this over to my little ruler. Let's use this one. And I'm going to measure that. It's 3 13/16 of an inch. I'm going to write that down. And then I'm going to do the same thing down here. The reason why I'm using this foam is this is the thickness of foam that we're going to wrap this with. If you decided to use a 2mm foam, then I would use a little strip of that foam. The reason being is when we wrap this, it's going to make the circumference a little bit bigger, and you just get a little bit more accurate a reading by using the actual thickness of foam. And this is about 3 1/8. Yeah, pretty much right at 3 1/8 of an inch. We'll write that down as well. Now I can take my 3mm foam and I just cut a little section off because I was tired of dealing with that giant sheet. And I have drawn a line down the middle of it, because kind of like we did before, I want to make a symmetrical shape. So my measurements are going to be coming out from the middle. Oh, also you're going to need to measure the length of your blade and make sure that it's 32 inches. So I also know that this is a 90-degree angle right there, that is square. And I'm just going to divide my 3 13/16 in half, which is about 1 7/8, I guess, plus 1/32 of an inch. I'm not going to give you millimeters on that because it doesn't matter. You need to take a measurement of what yours is and go with that, and you can use whatever unit of measure you would like. So what was it again? It was yeah, so plus a 32nd, and I can go the other direction as well. Sorry, I'm probably blocking everything with my head. Okay. So next I need to measure down from here the 32 inches. Okay. Now using a square or a protractor, I need fingernails. I'm just going to put a 90-degree angle here. And I'm going to measure, see, that was 3 1/8, so that's 1 9/16. So 1 9/16. Okay. And this foam is so flexible that there's going to be some stretching and compressing just to get it right. Hopefully it'll all go together without too much trouble. Okay, now I can just cut this out. move the camera around so it's a little easier. I'm just going to put a little arrow on here so I know which way the tip is. Okay, I want to get this as clean as possible. I think I'm gonna move this out of the way. That's easier said than done, though. Work as fast as quickly as possible without missing any spots. If you miss a part of the blade or the piece we're going to wrap the blade in, any spot you don't get glue, it's going to be loose. And the strength of this all comes from the fact that this will essentially be one large piece of foam once it's all glued together. Okay, now I'm just going to hold this for a few minutes, or a minute, and let it dry to the point that it's tacky. Okay, I think we're about right. And I'll be honest, I've never tried to do this on camera, so I don't know how this is going to go. It's always a bit of a challenge. Just remind yourself that there's nothing that can happen here that will be, you're not going to ruin anything with this. I'm going to line it up with the bottom. Roll it. Somehow I ended up a little long. Sometimes I think the act of putting the glue on there changes the dimensions. Just take your time. Try not to stretch it too much. I can almost guarantee it's going to be a little too long because it always stretches. Now you can try to bend this forward and get it to line up perfectly. And before I do that, I almost forgot one thing. We need to put glue on this edge and this edge. Now I need a smaller brush. Okay, now I can try to push this end down and get it to line up perfectly, and then push the rest of it around it. If it looks like you're going to get some bad wrinkles, then don't worry about it. Just let it overlap, and then you can cut any excess off, because it won't stick to the part that doesn't have glue on it. I'm trying to get the bottom edge of this to hit the bottom edge of this other side, and then I can force them together. It looks like there's more of a seam here than there is because of the black lines that I drew when I was measuring everything. Okay, for up here it's getting where I'm having a hard time getting it to line up. It's either I've stuck it down too far and there's not enough of this foam left over there's not enough room to get that to compress in and stick down. And basically I'm ending up with a big pocket there. So I may switch to an overlap here in just a second. If you've got some little gaps and things in your foam, don't worry, we're not done. You need a fine pen or a sharp pencil. I'm just marking where the overlap here is on this tip, and then where it is right there. I'm not pushing down very hard. Apparently I got a little sloppy with the glue when I was gluing that edge. When you glue your edge before you put this on, you won't have that problem. I think we're all done. Is it pretty? No, but that's going to be totally fine. Trust in the process. We're going to take care of all of this a little bit later. We'll sand any high spots down, and then we'll go over with some of that Alex quick dry and fill in any gaps, smooth everything out real nice, and we'll be perfect. I do want to trim off this little bit at the end here. We're about 1/4 of an inch over, it looks like. Okay. Okay, it's been about 3 hours, and that's plenty of time for this to, if not fully cure, then at least the cement is cured enough that it's not going to come apart. There's no chance this is peeling apart at all. And what I would normally do right now is to take this over to the Dremel and just clean up this seam here, you know, all the way down. But this video is already kind of running long, so I think I'll just put that off until we're prepping this for the Plasti Dip spray. And let's go ahead and work on putting a tip on this, and we'll be done with the blade for the most part. Okay, so there's basically two schools of thought on the tips of lightsabers. One of them is that the tip is just sort of a semicircle, and the other one is that it's got a little bit of a point on it. And whichever one you want to do, we'll do it the same way. I'm just going to come on here. You'll notice I had this a little bit lower. I find that it's a lot easier to do this if the sander's a bit lower. In fact, what I would normally do is the whole thing on the ground, but then you just see my feet. But we're going to just take this and I'm going to spin it like this, and then while I'm doing that, I will slowly go up at an angle. It'll take several passes just to get the shape the way I like it. If it's a little too pointy and you want it to be more of just a semicircle, you can always, just work on that to take off the tip. But don't forget to wear your dust mask, and let's go ahead and do this. I will say, remember that you've got a little bit of a flare here at the end. So if you start cutting way back here, if you start this, make sure I'm on camera. If you start this, an inch and a half back and make a real long curve on that, you're probably going to run into that flare that we have on the inside, on the end of that club shaft. So you really want to only start your round over whichever way you want to go. A half, maybe just a little more than a half of an inch, which is about a centimeter. Now I will say that I'm not putting pressure on this. I'm just letting it touch. I'm not pushing down at all because it'll obviously just remove a ton of foam if I do that. This is, could be a little bit rounder, but we're getting pretty close to, if you wanted sort of that traditional just semicircle curve here. But I prefer just a little bit more of the point to it as far as aesthetic wise. It's a little bit more in the Clone Wars series as opposed to the original trilogy. But let me go ahead and keep going on this. Okay, that's pretty much got it. I can refine this a little better with the Dremel. I can, take that little tip off and maybe smooth out this line that's here between where it's straight here and then has the curve here. That's maybe a little bit abrupt. I can smooth that out with the Dremel where I've got a little bit more control. But that's pretty much it for the blade, at least until we get ready to prep this for the plasti dip. It's kind of amazing how good this feels now compared to when it's just like this. This is actually kind of clunky and slow, and just taking those corners off like this, we're back to being pretty nice here. So don't get discouraged when you just put the foam on and haven't shaped it yet and you don't like the way it feels. By the way, the reason why we're doing the blade first, because it would be easier to do the pommel without the blade on, but it would be impossible to do the blade if we already had the pommel set up. We'd never be able to get those long, facets in the blade if we had a big piece right here on the end here. So we have to do the blade first. If you like these videos, please subscribe, give me a thumbs up, and click that bell so that you can continue on with the rest of the build. So once again, that's pretty much everything for the blade. In the next video, we'll get into working on the hilt, getting that designed the way you want it and feel good in your hand. And there's multiple ways we can go about making the hilt, but that's for the next video. So until then, thanks.